we have Mr. Antony Blinken, Secretary of State. Many view him as the point person in the Biden administration, given the state of Joe Biden himself. But he had some interesting things to say, maybe some infuriating things to say in his end of the year press conference. And I just wanted to read what he had to say about Russia and Ukraine. And of course, Russia was number one in terms of his commentary, his initial opening remarks during this press conference. And what he had to say was this: we will continue to rally countries around the world to support Ukraine's freedom and independence and ensure Russian aggression remains a strategic failure. Putin has already failed to achieve his principal objective in Ukraine, erasing it from the map, subsuming it into Russia. It's been a hard year on the battlefield, but once again, Ukrainians have done what no one thought was possible. They stood toe-to-toe with the world's biggest militaries. They conceded no territory despite multiple Russian offenses, and they pushed Russia's navy back to the Black Sea and opened a corridor to allow their export of grain and other products to the world. Russia is weaker militarily, economically, and diplomatically. NATO is bigger and stronger and more united than at any point in its 75-year history. This year, we added a 31st member of Finland, and Sweden will soon join. So maybe we can start with you, Larry. Your reactions on the state of this conflict, and how does your assessment comport with Antony Blinken's?
I guess the Russians probably get down on their knees every night and say, thank God for Antony Blinken. Anybody that's that delusional and that out of touch with reality is just helping them continue to, march along. It really is mystifying because he's not an uneducated man. He's been to some good schools, but I know that the definition of a diplomat is someone who's paid to lie for their country, but good Lord, this is just off the charts because not a thing he said was true. Simplicius the Thinker had a great chart up the other day showing all the naval activity in the Black Sea. And the area around Odessa, around the few ports that the Ukraine still controls, had one ship. That was it, one. So no activity. And the notion that what's alarming is that they really genuinely believe that they won some sort of military victory over Russia. And they have zero understanding of tactics. So it's just, we are seeing, though, the signs that things are changing. The fact that the Washington Post removed war in Ukraine from its banner on its website is the sign that even the Washington Post has figured out, the party's over here, dude. Turn out the lights.
Scott, you're in.
Well, I mean, I echo everything Larry said. Russia, Tony Blinken, first of all, invented a Russian objective. The Russian objectives were set forth early on, and they've been consistent throughout, non-changing. Demilitarization. Now, the definition of demilitarization has gone through a transformation, not because Russia changed the rules of the game, but because Ukraine and NATO changed the rules of the game. Initially, demilitarization was simply removing NATO influence from the Ukrainian military to eliminate the ability of NATO to influence Ukrainian operations. It wasn't the total destruction of the Ukrainian armed forces. The Russians made a big effort early on in the conflict to have the Ukrainian army stay in their barracks. That was one of their goals and objectives. And of course, the Ukrainians didn't do that everywhere. Some places they did. I think the rapid advance in the Kherson region was reflective of a lack of resistance on the part of the Ukrainians in that area because the Russian FSB had done a good job of going out and paving the way, so to speak. But the Russians weren't out to destroy Ukraine. We know this by the terms of the conflict termination agreement that had been negotiated in 3 rounds between Ukraine and Russia and Gomel, a 4th round in Turkey, where they being the Ukrainians and the Russians, initialed an agreement for final signature. That signature wasn't forthcoming because of the intervention of Boris Johnson. and others, including Lloyd Austin, who went to Kiev and told Zelensky, don't sign anything. You see, they interpreted Russia's willingness to negotiate as a sign of weakness. They don't realize that that was the Russian objective from day one. The whole purpose of the initial rush into Ukraine wasn't to seize territory. It was to compel Ukraine to the negotiating table so this conflict be terminated rather quickly. And indeed, one of the other Russian objectives was denazification. What's amazing about the March agreement is there's no denazification. I mean, that was a stated objective of Putin, but the March agreement was they're going to let Zelensky stay in power. No demands on constitutional changes, no demands on, elimination of Azov and other things. The only thing Russia, did say is you can't be a member of NATO and you have to basically be neutral in perpetuity. But Russia was very open to discuss, security guarantees. Russia was open. First of all, Russia said, we're going to return all the territory that we took. Literally, we're going to give it back. We have no desire to, what did Blinken say, subsume, Ukrainian territory. They did say that Crimea is theirs forever, but that was 2014, totally separate issue. They're never going to give any of it back, but Crimea was always Russian, never going to be Ukrainian. The Donbass, what's interesting is that the Russians said that while they won't, they can't give it back to Ukraine because the Donbass declared independence, what they said is that they will continue to be independent, but Russia will work with Ukraine to get a referendum to find out, where the citizens of Donbass want to go on that one. The Russians also said they're willing to sit down with the Ukrainians and talk about the political future of Crimea, meaning that they say, you want to make a case for Crimea? Let's do that. I mean, it's the most reasonable terms one could ever imagine. And it was turned down by the Ukrainians, who were led to believe that they could beat the Russians. And so they start the process of receiving what I called the game changer, the tens of billions of dollars worth of it. It changed the game. It made the game longer. It made the game more complicated. It required the Russians to mobilize 300,000 reserves to expand, their military capacity. In addition to 300,000 reserves, 475,000 volunteers have signed up for the special military operation at a rate of 1,500 a day. The Ukrainians are out there, hijacking a couple hundred guys off the streets every day who don't want to go to the fight. The Russians they're just pouring in. The nation is mobilized around this, willingly so. And but the purpose was always the destruction of the Ukrainian military. In terms of their ability to influence. The more Ukraine absorbed NATO equipment, the larger the requirement for the destruction of the Ukrainian military. Today, it's 100%. The Ukrainian military will not survive this conflict. It will be 100% eliminated. The Ukrainians can decide how they want to do that. They can all die. Russia's more than happy to facilitate that. Russia would prefer that they surrender. And Russia is doing everything possible to encourage surrendering. Now, they have this radio frequency that they're encouraging people. I think Volga, they call it, to have people come over and surrender. But anybody who thinks that the Ukrainians have prevailed on this battlefield don't know anything about war. The Ukraine has been slaughtered on this battlefield. The Russians are engaged in something called flexible defense. The key aspect of flexible defense is that you don't fight and die for indefensible territory. It understands that in war, on occasion, the enemy can get tactical and sometimes even operational superiority. And when that happens, the smart military leader says, gosh, we probably should withdraw to better defensive ground over here, consolidate our lines, get some fire support in, and break it up. So they withdraw. And it's done in a pre-planned area. You go back to positions you've already decided you're going to fall back on. You have fire support coming in, and you break up the Ukrainian attacks. Ukrainians get some territory, but then they all die. Then the Russians counterattack and get the territory back. That's what's been going on. And so, Blinken is trying to lead us to believe that the Russians have made no gains. I don't know. 400,000 dead Ukrainians sounds like a lot of gains to me. Hundreds of tanks, including the Leopards. You remember the Leopard? It was that invincible German tank that was going to change the course. No, they're all burning. The Bradley, not Bradley. Oh, it's burning. The Martyr, it's burning. I mean, you can come up with all the little names they got. They're all burning. They're out of ammunition. They're out of armor. They're out of everything. They're out of people. That's why we were talking about, Hodges talking about the need to get women and old men and everything to replicate what the Germans were doing in 44. It wasn't, I saw a comment, wasn't just about the Russians, the Germans producing more tanks. It was about the mobilization of Germany in 44, the Volkssturm and all this wonderful stuff that was, led to the death of a lot of Germans that didn't need to die. And that's where the Ukrainians are right now with mobilization. I mean, where are they going to come from? The people don't want to fight. I guess there's 270,000 military-age men who fled Ukraine that the Ukrainians are trying to get back in. But do you really think these guys are going to be motivated? I mean, again, war is, everybody talks about superior equipment. I always say that the equipment is nice, but what's more important is the quality of the foot and the boot. Because that's how you win wars. You don't win wars with a beautiful gleaming tank. You win wars with a guy that knows what he's doing, a guy who's physically fit, a guy who's mentally has mental capacity, who wants to be there, who's motivated to be there, who believes in the mission, who is trained to do this. Ukrainians are getting 13, 14 days basic training. That's it. If they're lucky, they can you get that at a NATO course, 14 days, and then they come back and they're given a couple weeks to learn this new equipment. Then they're thrown into the battlefield. The Russians, meanwhile, when they were mobilized, if you had recent military experience, you put through sort of a refresher course to prove that you knew how to do A, B, and C, and then you were sent in as a individual replacement. The rest of the guys were put together into units and put through months of training. Some of them have yet to be committed into combat, and they continuously be retrained. The Russians are pulling units out of the front line, sending them to a training zone to update them on tactics. Larry, you probably drone warfare. What drone warfare was when the conflict started and what it is today is two totally different things. It's a revolution in warfare, what's going on with drones right now. And if you aren't training for it, if you're not preparing for it, adapting this to your tactics and operations, you're going to die. So the Russians are doing this all the time. They're the most well-trained, they're the most combat-hardened military force in the world today. There's nothing that comes remotely close to what the Russians are. And Tony Blinken thinks that the Russians are losing. The Russians have broken the Ukrainian military. The Ukrainian military has suffered a strategic defeat. What's happening now is that Russia is starting to push steadily. The Ukrainians have admitted they can't continue the counteroffensive. They've gone back on what they call the strategic defense, but it's not a defense in depth. Who is the Ukrainian equivalent of General Alexander Romanchuk? The former deputy commander, 5th Aid Army, went to the Combined Arms Academy, was pulled out of the Combined Arms Academy after he rewrote Russian defensive doctrine, took charge of the Zaporizhia front right by the Robotino area, and built the defense that crushed the Ukrainian counteroffensive. This is a genius in military. Who is the Ukrainian equivalent? They've all been working on the counteroffensive. Suddenly they're going to go over on the defensive. But have they thought it through? Have they prepared it? They're digging trenches. They're putting things out. It looks good. But I can guarantee you, A, they don't have the reserves necessary to do to make a flexible defense work. They're looking at fixed defensive lines. The Russians will break through these lines. When the Russians break through, where is the Ukrainian counterattack? They don't have anything anymore. They got no more brigades. They're not making any more brigades. They ran out of money. They ran out of tanks. They ran out of men. When the Russians break through, the Ukrainians got nothing. This war's over, but this doesn't mean that it's all over. I'll give you an example. I think everybody can concede that after the Battle of the Bulge, it was known that Germany couldn't defeat the West. I mean, after the Battle of Kursk in 43, it was known that Germany couldn't defeat Russia. The strategic initiative had changed. What was the bloodiest month for American troops in World War II in the East, in the European zone? Was it June when they went across Normandy? No. Was it December when they fought the Battle of the Bulge? Nope. Was it in March when they were fighting Hurtgen Forest? Nope. It was April, the last month of the war. April 1945 was the bloodiest month for Americans in the Western theater. Why? The Germans were defeated, strategically defeated. It was done. There was no one. Vegas wouldn't allow any odds on Germany winning this war. That's how bad it was. And yet the Germans killed more Americans that month. Why? Because there's a lot of fight left in a dying animal. So the implication when I say that Ukraine is defeated, people go, but they're still fighting, Scott. Yeah, and they may fight for months, but it's over. They literally, the strategic initiative has gone over to Russia, and Blinken's just deluding himself when he talks about, and it's not just at the defeat of the Russian army. Vladimir Putin said something very interesting the other day. He said that Odessa is a Russian city. Now, the thing about Putin is he says he doesn't waste words. Vladimir Putin's not a guy that go out and say things. He's not an American politician trying to impress people. When he speaks, his words have meaning, and he says nothing lightly. So when Vladimir Putin comes out and says, no, Odessa's a Russian city, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Odessa's going to be a Russian city. That means this war ain't over till Russia takes Odessa, seals off the Black Sea coast. Now, why would Russia want to do this? Oh, maybe because Great Britain and the United States helped Ukraine turn the Odessa area into a platform to threaten the Russian fleet in Sevastopol and make Crimea, to make things untenable in Crimea. Russia will never allow, ever again, Ukraine to be used in that fashion. So this war cannot end until Russia eliminates Odessa and the Black Sea coast as being a potential strategic zone of operations to threaten Crimea. Crimea is very important to Russia. So Black Sea, Ukraine's lost it. This war won't end until they have it. I spoke to a senior Russian who says he thinks that that offensive may begin sometime in the May-June time period. Now, why that long? Well, I don't know, because if you're going to take Odessa, you got to take Mykolaiv. If you're going to take Mykolaiv, you got to take Dnipropetrovsk. If you take Dnipropetrovsk, you got to secure Kharkov. And so now we just identified what the Russians are going to do. Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv, Odessa. Secure Donetsk, recapture Kherson. You get the right bank of Kherson as you come down through Mykolaiv. You secure Zaporizhia. Ukraine's going to have to lose another 20-25% of its territory by the time this is done. Not because Russia started out that. As I said, Russia had no intention of doing this. This is what NATO caused. This is what happens when you give Ukraine $220 billion worth of military equipment and financial assistance to take on the Russians. When you do that, you sacrificed Ukraine. Ukraine is a strategically defeated nation. We're looking at not just military disaster, and a political disaster. Zelensky is going down the drain. There's talk right now. I mean, you see an open break, and again, Larry, you, I'm sure you were involved in teaching foreign officers and such. What's the first thing we tell foreign officers? The importance of civilian control of the military. That there's important. We balance civil military relations. Well, in Ukraine, it's broken, ladies and gentlemen. Zelensky's spying on his commander in chief. Zelensky is actively, going behind Zelensky, trying to bring him down. Zelensky's getting involved in politics. This ain't going to end well. I'm loath for very specific predictions, but I am predicting that if this situation doesn't get resolved, there will be a coup sometime in January, February, and Zelensky will go the way of Nicholas Ceausescu. He will be running through a backyard someplace begging, and they're just going to gun him down and kill him because he's done. He's finished. He's delusional. The press conference he gave was, you could have taken Adolf Hitler and imagined him giving a press conference in April of 1945, moving armies around, mobilizing 500,000. None of it exists because the Russians have already kicked your butt. They're coming in, taking Berlin. Russia's kicked Ukraine's butt. They're coming in. They're taking it. Zelensky is insane. But that's what Blinken, and again, Larry, you're 100% right. I think the Russians go to bed every night praying and that America has such geniuses like Tony Blinken, Lloyd Austin, Jake Sullivan, and Joe Biden. I mean, that quad right there is a guarantee of Russian strategic defeat, not just of Ukraine, but of NATO and also of the United States. And as an American, I don't like my country being strategically defeated. But man, we sort of earned this one.
Larry, I wanted to bring you back in. You recently wrote in your Substack, Ukraine turned the lights out, the party is over. You showed the Washington Post moving the war in Ukraine to the top hand side, almost as if it's just another topic. It's no longer special.
Well, they took it. They removed it so that
they
the
removed
top
it
image
altogether.
shows you. You see the banner where it says
"Oh,
war
hold
in
on,
Ukraine?
yes. Let's look at this closely."
They come down to the next one, which was
the
the
it's
succeeding day.
gone. Okay,
They took it out. So
well,
when the Washington Post is saying, "Okay, we no longer need to do that," because if you click on those links anymore, the stories that are coming up are not all the happy stories, about
Right.
fireworks and potato salad and summer picnics. Grim tidings are at hand.
Mm.
That let's put it in perspective. Do you know how large the active duty U.S. Army is, manpower wise? I don't expect you to know, but it's 472,000. So think about that. Zelensky's claiming he can create an army bigger than the U.S. Army in the next 6 months. That's what Scott pointed out. That's crazy talk. That's the cocaine talking. Okay, he's he is out of touch with reality. And what Americans are not paying attention to, particularly members of Congress, legislators, is that while Russia may have started off the special military operation at a numerical disadvantage to the U.S. military, that's no longer the case. As Scott noted earlier, the Russians have, since January 1st, have brought in an average of 41,250 new recruits every month. So they're on track in 1 year to do over 480,000 soldiers for the Army, which it's going to boost then their total military strength to 1.3 million as far as the Army goes. Well, that's bigger than the U.S. Army if you count in National Guard and Army Reserve, etc. So right now, Russia, with half our population, has got a larger army in place, and then when you factor in Navy, Air Force assets, Russia's going to be up around 2.2 million, which is well in excess of what the United States can field. So, Russia's getting ready. Now, they had the unanticipated benefit of this special military operation. I don't think at the outset they had any idea that they would demilitarize NATO. But that's exactly what's happened. They've exposed it. And in fact, the U.S. military is in real trouble across the board, not just the Army. I discovered this week, I didn't realize it, but that in the early 90s, the United States got rid of all of its ship and submarine tenders, these supply ships that follow along behind Navy convoys, and that when a destroyer fires off all of its missiles, then that supply ship can come up alongside and pass those missiles off. The United States got rid of all those in the early 90s, thanks to Bill Clinton. And guess what? All these destroyers we've got off in the Red Sea, they've got 90. Each destroyer has about 90 missiles. They fire those. There's no more. It's not like they can call up FedEx or Amazon and say, "Hey, I'd like to put in an order for 1,000 Aegis missiles." Because those babies only cost $2 million a pop, and the Yemenis are shooting it off at $2,000 a drone. So, where did we first discover this thing? In Ukraine, where the Ukrainians can't make any shells or even enough to keep themselves supplied. And the United States all of a sudden discovered it had trashed its industrial capability. So now there is no way to supply shells, artillery shells, 155 millimeter, 152 millimeter to Ukraine. And then the law of mathematics kicks in. If Russia can fire 8 shots to every 1 shot that Ukraine does, Russia has about an 8 times greater chance of inflicting casualties. It's like, Scott used to be a boxer. So if we stood up and I say, "Okay, Scott, I'm going to hit you once." Then he says, "Okay, but I'm going to hit you 8 times." I wouldn't be standing at the end, okay? I might not even make it past the second punch. So that's where this brings in the whole issue of casualties and manpower losses. There is no army in the world that can be hit with that kind of disadvantage and firepower like Ukraine has been pummeled, that can emerge from that with, intact, not too many dead and wounded, It's just the opposite. So, the truth is finally coming out, and all of these different newspapers are starting to report it. Not just the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Economist, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times. What was really sort of funny is the New York Times did this piece of talking about how Ukraine was kidnapping guys off the streets. Oh man, this is shocking, dude. That was happening 18 months ago. Scott was talking about it. I was talking about it. We wrote about it. But now they're just discovering that, it's like that scene from Casablanca, gambling in a casino. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, the situation has indeed changed quite dramatically, even just in the last year. And, I know Scott gave his predictions, Larry. I don't know if you have any predictions for 2024 about where this conflict is heading, because it seems, as you all both noted, very different from how maybe Blinken and these neocon psychopaths see it in their heads, or like to portray it to be, even if they might know better in private. Though their public face is a lot different. What do you have any predictions?
Well, I think the possibilities for rapid deflation are, very high. I'll be surprised if Zelensky makes it to January 1st, to New Year's. The kind of political turmoil and manipulation and maneuvering that's going on is significant. And I always learned, as an old Latin American analyst, spent a lot of time in Central America, always bet on the guys with the guns when it comes to coups. All Zelensky's good at is, playing the piano with one of his appendages. That doesn't help you when the guys coming down the hallway got rifles and guns. It's actually like that scene from did you see the movie Death of Stalin? It was out 2-3 years ago. It's hilarious. And at one scene, the guy that plays Zhukov, General Zhukov, comes in, and one of Stalin's kids is mouthing off, and he just whomps him in the face, punches him, and he's down. And then they take out Beria later. They got the guns on him. Well, Beria may have been an evil monster, but Zhukov and boys had the guns. That's what's going to happen to Zelensky. He's not. He'll be lucky to survive this, to see if he winds up in any of his other properties. I do hear some of these analysts, people talk about that this war's at a stalemate, which means they don't know the definition of stalemate. They've never played chess. That this could drag on for 2 or 3 years. And I'm going, what? United States is not going to be writing that check. Sorry. And once Uncle Sugar starts sending over the sweetener, Ukraine is done. They got enough for a week or two. So I think we'll see an end to this thing by next summer.